There's a particular kind of silence that only happens when 200 people realize, all at once, that they have profoundly misunderstood someone. I know what that silence sounds like. I've heard it. And I spent 34 years waiting for it. My father texted me 3 days before my brother's wedding. Not called. Texted. 11 words. Please don't make this about you. Just be normal for once. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter of my apartment in Halifax and stood there for a long time, looking at the wall. Outside it was the kind of gray November afternoon that Nova Scotia does better than anywhere else on Earth. The kind that makes the whole world feel like an old photograph. I poured myself a glass of scotch, neat, the way my grandfather used to drink it, and I thought about the first time my father looked at me, like I was a problem he hadn't planned for. I was 19. I'd just told my parents I'd been accepted to Royal Military College in Kingston. My mother had gone quiet in the particular way. She goes quiet when she doesn't want to say the wrong thing. My father had laughed. Not a cruel laugh, more like a laugh of disbelief, the kind you let out when someone tells you something that doesn't quite compute. You want to join the military, he said. It wasn't a question. I want to be an officer, I said. I want to serve. He looked at my mother. My mother looked at the tablecloth. Nora, he said. That's me, Nora. Your brother just got into the engineering program at U of T. Your cousin is starting law school in the fall. What is it about this family that makes you want to go in the opposite direction from everyone else? I didn't have a good answer for that. Not one he would have understood. How do you explain to someone who measures success in salary and square footage that you feel called somewhere, that the idea of wearing that uniform, of being part of something larger than any single person, had been living in you since you were 12 years old, and watched a documentary about Canadian peacekeepers in Bosnia, and felt something shift in your chest that never quite shifted back? You don't. You just sit there and eat your dinner and tell yourself that they'll understand someday. They didn't, or at least, they pretended not to. My brother had always been the one they pointed to. And I want to be clear, my brother is a good man. Genuinely. He's kind and funny, and he worked hard for everything he has. This isn't about him. But when your parents spend 18 years telling you that your sibling is the benchmark for a successful life, it leaves a mark. My brother went to university on a scholarship, became a structural engineer, bought a house in Oakville at 31, and married a woman my mother described as exactly what you'd hope for. By the time he was 34, my parents spoke about him the way people speak about a favorite painting. With pride so effortless it had become unconscious. Me, they spoke about carefully. With the particular tone people use when they're trying to put a positive spin on something they find confusing. Our daughter is in the military, my mother would say at dinner parties, and then quickly add, she's doing very well, very dedicated, as if she needed to preempt whatever judgment she imagined people were making. My father just avoided the topic altogether, mostly. At Christmas, at Thanksgiving, at the occasional Sunday dinners I made at home for between postings. He'd ask about the drive, about the weather, about whether I want more potatoes. He did not ask about my work. He did not ask what I was proud of. He did not ask what I'd seen or where I'd been or what it had cost me. I served for 16 years before I made Lieutenant Colonel. I won't list every posting, every deployment, every decision that kept me up at night. But I will say this. I spent 8 months in Mali as part of a United Nations stabilization mission. I spent 14 months in Latvia with NATO. I came home from each of those postings quieter and more certain, all at once, which is a strange combination. But that's what service does to you. It takes something loud out of you and replaces it with something steadier. I was 36 when I was promoted to colonel. I called home that evening, standing in the parking lot of the base in Gagetown in the November cold, because I didn't want anyone to hear me be hopeful. My mother answered. That's wonderful, sweetheart, she said. Your father's watching the hockey game. Do you want me to have him call you back? He didn't call back. Not that evening. 3 days later he texted to say he'd heard the news and was glad things were going well. I saved that text. I don't know why. Maybe because even the smallest thing felt like evidence of something. The wedding was in Toronto. My brother was marrying a woman I liked very much. Her name was Claire, and she was warm and funny and the kind of person who remembered the small things you'd mentioned months ago and asked about them. She had actually called me herself a few weeks before, to ask if I'd be comfortable attending in uniform. Her father had served in the Navy for 22 years. Several of her uncles were veterans. Her family had specifically requested that any active or former military guests attend in dress uniform because they wanted to honor that tradition at the reception. I want you there as you are, she said. Not in some dress that doesn't feel like you. I told her I would be honored. My father's text arrived 3 days later. Please don't make this about you. Just be normal for once. I thought about calling him. I rehearsed it, the way you do, turning over the words, trying to find the version of the conversation that ended with him understanding something. But I know my father. Not the version of him I wanted to have. The one who would sit across a table and say, "I think I've gotten this wrong." I know the actual man, the one who has spent 34 years being proud of things he could explain to other people and quietly uncomfortable with things he couldn't. I know that man very well, and I knew that no phone call was going to move him. So I texted back, "See you at the wedding." And I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in my apartment in Halifax and listened to the wind off the harbor and thought about the 19-year-old girl who had sat at her parents' kitchen tables and tried to explain something she didn't yet have the language for. I thought about her the way you think about a younger version of yourself, with tenderness and a little bit of grief, and something that is almost gratitude because she made choices that the person lying awake in the dark 34 years later is still grateful for. I drove to the airport the next morning in my dress uniform. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Claire was radiant. My brother cried at the altar, which I had not expected, and which made me love him more than I already did. I sat in the third pew on the left with my father 2 rows behind me, and I didn't turn around to look at him once. At the reception, it was different. The venue was a restored historic building in the Distillery District. All exposed brick and warm light. The kind of place that makes winter feel romantic instead of just cold. Claire's family had booked out the entire main hall. The room held close to 200 people, and because of who Claire's family was and who they'd invited, a significant portion of those people were either active military or veterans. Some in uniform, some not, but you could always tell. My brother came to find me during cocktail hour. He hugged me tight and then held me at arm's length the way he used to when we were kids, and he wanted to look at my face to figure out what I was feeling. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm good," I said. "You look terrified." "I'm excellent," he said. "I'm just also terrified." I laughed. He'd always been able to do that. Make me laugh when I needed it most without seeming to try. We were called in for dinner. I found my seat. My father was across the room at a table with my aunts and uncles, and I watched him take in the room. The uniforms. The decorations Claire's mother had chosen that incorporated the maple leaf and the poppy. And I watched something flicker across his face that I couldn't quite name. The dinner was long and warm and full of the kind of toasts that make you feel like the world is, on balance, an okay place to be. Claire's father spoke for 12 minutes without notes and made everyone in the room cry at least once. My brother's best man told a story about a road trip they'd taken to Cape Breton that was so funny 3 people nearly spit out their drinks. I gave my toast early in the evening before dessert. I kept it short. I talked about my brother's kindness, genuine, not the performative kind, and about Claire's grace, and about what it meant to build a life with someone who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway. I said something like, "The best love is the kind that doesn't ask you to be smaller than you are." I hadn't planned that line. It just came out. I heard my voice say it and felt it land somewhere in my chest that I hadn't expected. I sat back down. My father was looking at his plate. It was later in the evening, after the cake was cut and the dancing had started, and the room had shifted into that looser, warmer energy that good parties always eventually find. That's when it happened. I was walking back from the bar, holding a glass of water, threading through the crowd. Claire's father saw me from across the room and straightened. He'd been a commander in the Navy, retired now, and there was still something in the way he moved that was completely unmistakable. He looked at my rank insignia. He looked at my medals. His eyes went to my face, and then he turned to the room and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of it, "Colonel on deck." What happened next is difficult to describe if you've never seen it, or felt it. Because that's the thing about military bearing. You don't think about it. It's not a choice in the moment. It lives in the body. And in that room, every person who had ever served, every person who had learned that reflex and carried it in their bones, came to attention. It moved through the crowd like a wave. People stopped mid-sentence, glasses were set down, conversation ended, chairs pushed back, they stood. I counted afterward, roughly, the way you do when your brain needs something concrete to hold on to. Close to 180 people. Veterans, serving members, family. People who'd never worn a uniform but who understood what they were witnessing and stood anyway. The room was completely quiet. I have been in rooms full of people before. I have been in briefing rooms and mess halls and forward operating bases and parliamentary committee hearings. I have learned, over 34 years, to keep my face composed, to present the version of myself that the moment requires. I almost didn't manage it. I stood straight. I looked at Claire's father, and I returned the salute. Someone at the far end of the room started to clap. Then another person. Within about 4 seconds, the room was full of it. Not the polite applause of an audience being appropriate, but the real kind, the loud kind, the kind that fills a space completely. I looked, without meaning to, at my father. He was standing. He had stood with everyone else, which I think surprised him as much as it surprised me. His hands were not clapping. He was just standing, looking at me, with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not pride, exactly. Something more complicated than pride. Something that looked, from where I was standing, a lot like the beginning of understanding. I looked away. I found Claire in the crowd. She was crying, which made me feel guilty for about half a second before she caught my eye and shook her head and mouthed, "Not bad." My brother was next to her, and he was crying too, and for a moment the three of us were just looking at each other across the room, and I thought, this is what family is supposed to feel like. The rest of the evening passed the way the rest of evenings pass after moments like that. A little softer, a little more awake. People I'd never met came to introduce themselves and shake my hand. An elderly woman who'd served as a nursing officer in the 70s held my arm for a moment and said, "You don't know how much it used to cost us, doing what we did. You don't know what it means that you're standing here like this." I didn't have words for that, so I just held her hand for a moment and nodded, and I think she understood. My father found me near the end of the night, when the crowd had thinned, and the DJ was playing quieter songs, and people were collecting their coats and saying their slow goodbyes. He stood next to me for a moment without saying anything. My father has never been a man who finds words easily. He comes from a generation and a family where the feelings were real. But the language for them was never developed, where you showed up, and you provided, and you were present, and that was supposed to be enough. I had spent a lot of years being angry at him for that. I spent some years not being angry anymore, which is different from being at peace with it but better than the alternative. "Nora," he said. "Hi, Dad." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He took out an envelope, slightly worn at the corners, the kind of envelope that has been in a drawer for a long time. "I've been carrying this around for a week," he said, trying to decide. I took the envelope. It was unsealed. Inside was a single photograph. A printout of a newspaper photograph, actually, from what looked like a Halifax Chronicle Herald article. It was grainy, the way newspaper photos are, but clear enough. It was me. 12 years ago, in Latvia, being presented with a commendation. I was in my combats. I looked young and serious and tired, the way you always look in those photographs. On the back, in my father's handwriting, precise, slightly cramped, the hand of a man who trained as a draftsman before CAD made it obsolete. He had written, "My daughter, always knew she'd get there." I looked at the photograph for a long time. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "Been keeping track," he said. "The internet makes it easier than you'd think." I didn't know what to say to that. There's a version of me that wanted to be angry. Wanted to say then, "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you let me carry this for 34 years? Why did it take 200 people standing up in a room to make you take a worn envelope out of a drawer?" And those feelings were real. I'm not pretending they weren't. But I'm also 34 years older than the girl who sat at that kitchen table. And I know, now, what it costs some people to say the things that matter. I know that silence isn't always indifference. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's a person standing in front of something they don't know how to hold, building up the nerve for years until the moment is so obvious it can't be avoided. I slid the photograph back into the envelope. I folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket, next to my heart. "I've been keeping track too," I said, "just differently." My father nodded. He looked at the floor. He looked back up. "I'm sorry," he said. "I could have been better at this." 5 words. 6, technically. Simple as that. The thing I had wanted for 34 years, delivered in a banquet hall at 10:30 at night, while a DJ played something slow in the background, and my brother danced with his new wife in the middle of the floor. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. There was no long speech, no tearful embrace. He's not that kind of man, and honestly, I'm not sure I'm that kind of woman anymore. What happened instead was quiet. He put his hand on my arm for a moment, and I put my hand over his, and we stood there for a few seconds watching my brother and Claire move slowly in the light. "She's good for him," my father said eventually. "She is," I said. "You gave a good speech. Thank you." And that was all. He went to find my mother. I went to find my coat. I hugged my brother and Claire so long at the end of the night that my brother started laughing and said, "Okay, I think we're done. You can let go now." Which was exactly the right note to end on. I drove back to my hotel on the 401, with the city lights glowing in my rearview mirror, and the envelope on the passenger seat beside me. I thought about the photograph, my father's handwriting, my daughter. Always knew she'd get there. I thought about the 19-year-old sitting at the kitchen table, trying to explain something she couldn't put into words yet. If I could go back and sit beside her, I'd want to tell her. The validation you're looking for, you're going to build it yourself, from the inside out, and it's going to be more solid than anything anyone else could have handed you. And the people who can't see you clearly right now, some of them are going to try to find their way there, eventually, in the ways that they know how. And it won't be everything you imagined, but it will be something real. But I can't go back. None of us can. What we get instead is the present, which was a worn envelope on a passenger seat, the highway home, and somewhere behind me, the first night of my brother's marriage still going. I turned on the radio, found a station playing old country, drove the rest of the way in the dark, with the heater running and the photograph in my pocket, feeling, for the first time in longer than I could name, like the distance between who I was and who I'd needed to be, had finally, quietly closed.